The Bible tells us very simply, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In John 1:14, he says, and the Word became flesh, and then he names him Jesus Christ.
Jesus has influenced more people for more good in more places than any other solitary individual.
I'm absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ not only claimed to be God, but he proved it by being resurrected from the dead.
The physical corpse of Jesus decayed as all corpses do. Any story about a missing body developed only later in response to Christian claims about the resurrection.
Either Jesus of Nazareth was who he claimed to be, or the whole Christian faith is futile and the whole Christian message is vain.
The ancient argument over the life of Jesus Christ has been revived, ignited once again by new discoveries, new technologies, and new thinking. In the past half-century, there have been more scientific breakthroughs than in all our past history. Have any of these discoveries helped to uncover a divine Christ, or have they confirmed a mythical Jesus?
Most Christians don't want the real Jesus. They want only the cultic Jesus, a Jesus they can worship, who has little to do with what Jesus actually said and did historically.
During my 2-year investigation of the historical evidence for Jesus Christ, I came across over 100 facts from documents outside the Bible that talked about the general contours of the life of Jesus Christ, including his miracles, including his teachings, and especially his resurrection from the dead.
Has modern scholarship finally been able to focus new light on this 2,000-year-old discussion? Do we really know who Jesus of Nazareth was? Or is it all just scholarly speculation and religious statements of faith? Is it possible that modern archaeological discoveries have given us new insights into the ancient records of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth? Was the man from Galilee a worker of miracles? Did he feed thousands, cause the blind to see? Or was it all just a marvelous fiction?
I don't think Jesus spoke of himself as the Son of God, or as the Word of God, or as the light of the world.
Jesus made utterly fantastic claims about himself, and he backed it up with his words and his deeds, and he proved it by his death and resurrection from the dead.
Can modern astronomy confirm the appearance of a spectacular event in the heavens at the moment of Christ's birth? Or is it possible there never was a miraculous birth 2,000 years ago?
There is no scientific, historical, physical, or biblical evidence for proving Jesus ever existed.
There is more evidence for the historical reliability of the New Testament than any 10 pieces of classical literature combined.
Can it be reliably stated that new archaeological, scientific, and historical discoveries are on the threshold of giving us a fresh and more comprehensive look at some of the old traditions? Is it possible that this ordinary piece of linen cloth might provide actual scientific proof of the resurrection?
It is an absolute fact that the shroud is a painting, period.
Anyone who has examined the shroud up close and personal knows that those pigments have nothing to do with the image.
Will we finally discover the answer with our modern telescope or with the microscope? Scientists, historians, gospel experts, and critics are about to examine Jesus, the evidence.
You are about to participate in what is probably the oldest and most important discussion in history. Simply stated, the proposition is this: is Jesus Christ the living Son of God? Or is he the glamorized invention of a religious zealotry that has maintained a popular fiction for nearly 2,000 years? Have new scientific, historic, and archaeological discoveries given us a clearer picture of the man named Jesus Christ? Or have these discoveries simply sharpened the conflict? There's little argument about the impact the life of Jesus of Nazareth has had on the world. Great empires, created through the power of mighty armies, have been subdued by the power of his message of love. And that message, as recorded by his disciples and collected in this book, the Bible, still echoes down through the centuries. Is the record factual? Is there available historical and scientific evidence to support the claims contained in this book?
To say that God raised Jesus from the dead is a statement of faith, and like all statements of faith, that can neither be proved nor disproved.
Well, instead of discrediting the Bible, modern archaeology and scholarship have repeatedly reaffirmed its essential accuracy.
An important goal of the Jesus Seminar has been to set Jesus free. Most Christians don't want the real Jesus, they want only the cultic Jesus, a Jesus they can worship, who has little to do with what Jesus actually said and did historically.
It's like the Apostle Paul said, if Jesus Christ did not raise from the dead, your faith is vain, it's worthless. Christianity is a sham and a deception if what it says about Jesus Christ isn't true.
For most of this century, beginning with Albert Schweitzer's book In Search of the Historical Jesus in 1906, and continuing today in the form of the Jesus Seminar, headed by Robert Funk and Dr. John Dominic Crossan, skeptical criticism of Jesus among academics has been growing and persistent.
Was the man called Christ the literal Son of God, working miracles among his own, teaching mankind the truth about God and the world to come? Or was he, as Dr. Crossan suggests, simply a somewhat extraordinary peasant and itinerant Jewish preacher caught up in the politics of the day?
In ancient times, a prophet had only two choices. He was either correct or he was stoned to death. Short-term prophecy was a very risky business indeed. A prophet who survived was either remarkably lucky or remarkably accurate.
Now, anyone can make predictions, but having them fulfilled is another story. The science of probability has some interesting things to say about the Old Testament prophecies regarding a Messiah. Professor Emeritus of Science Peter Stoner of Westmont College, with the help of 600 college students, calculated the probability of one man fulfilling just 8 of the Messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. The students carefully weighed all the factors and examined the various circumstances which might indicate that men had somehow conspired together to fix these individual prophecies. They made their estimates as conservative as possible. Then Professor Stoner invited other scientists to submit their own independent estimates to gauge if the calculations of his students were accurate. Yet it was what the statistical conclusions indicated that was astounding. By the most conservative estimate, some 456 Messianic prophecies were fulfilled in one man, Jesus of Nazareth. But Professor Stoner and his students examined only 8 of those prophecies. According to the science of probability, the chance of one man fulfilling all 8 prophecies is 1 in 10 to the 17th power. How big a number is 10 to the 17th power? If you covered the entire state of Texas to a depth of 2 feet with silver dollars, and then dropped in a single marked dollar and mixed them all up, your chance of finding that marked dollar on your first try wearing a blindfold would be 1 in 10 to the 17th power.
Statistical science, then, suggests a high degree of probability that Jesus was the Messiah predicted by the prophets of the Old Testament. So let's take a look at some of those prophecies.
Know all men of Nazareth, that by command of Caesar Augustus there will be conducted a census of the subject territories of Galilee and Judea. All men must register in the towns and cities of their birth.
According to Micah chapter 5, verse 2, Bethlehem was chosen for a pivotal event. Out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are of old, from ancient times.
When Luke the physician sat down to write a letter to Theophilus, so that he might know the exact order of events in the life of the one called Jesus Christ. It tells about the birth of Jesus. Mary and Joseph were required to go to Bethlehem because there was a taxation going on ordered by Caesar Augustus. Luke tells us that this enrollment came at the time of Caesar Augustus, and Quirinius was governor of Syria at that time. And when this enrollment, this taxation process was required, it was the first. There were others that were going to follow.
In chapters 1 and 2, Luke wants to say that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of David. And to do so in a story form, he sends Jesus, in the womb of Mary, of course, back to be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. And the reason he says that happens is there was a census, for taxation purposes, of course, and Joseph has to go back to his ancestral home. The problem with that is there was no such census at the time Jesus was born, and the Romans would not have sent people back in any case, if there was a census, to their ancestral homes. That would have simply created a bureaucratic nightmare.
For years, there were no references to Quirinius, the governor of Syria. And then they found one reference that said, well, wait a minute, that's not at the same time that Luke was saying that the census took place. But now they have found other historical references that seems to indicate either he had a very long reign or he was governor twice of Syria. And all of a sudden, the historical record, apart from Luke's writing, says this is totally feasible and it is plausible.
The truth is that modern archaeology has illuminated this issue in such a way that we can have great confidence that Luke was essentially accurate in what he was reporting. In fact, we have an ancient document that's dated 104 AD that confirms that people who were living away from their provinces needed to return home to their provinces for the census. We also have another document dated 48 AD that confirms that entire families were involved in this census. And so we have documents which talk about the same kind of census that Luke records in the New Testament.
The writers of the Gospels have also given us other clues that might be subject to modern scientific examination. For example, the star. Given the immutable structure of the heavens, is it possible that modern astronomical computers can recreate the position of the planets in the sky at the moment of the birth of Jesus? Is there non-biblical information that supports the idea of some sort of heavenly occurrence that was out of the ordinary? Could there, in fact, have been a star in the east heralding the most important event in human history? There's one indisputable fact about the life of Jesus that everyone accepts. That is that the vast majority of everything we know today about the life of Jesus is gleaned from the New Testament, more specifically the four Gospels, which believers accept as the testament of his life and which, along with the rest of the Bible, have become the hands-down best-selling literary work of all time. Overall, there is no book that even begins to compare to the circulation of the Bible. Not long ago, the British and Foreign Bible Society reported that in order to meet its demand, it had to publish 32,876 copies of the Bible every day of the year. And that is just one publisher. But the critic quickly points out that popularity is not proof that the record is factual. Is there available historical evidence that supports the Bible's authenticity?
Well, the Hittites were a group of people that were mentioned 47 times in the Old Testament. And for many years, we felt like they were nothing more than religious mythology. But then in 1876, a German cuneiform expert discovered 5 Hittite temples. And within those temples were 10,000 clay tablets that were discovered that had the names of the Hittites on those tablets, confirming the truth of the Old Testament.
The discovery of the cuneiform tablets put to rest once and for all the argument about the historicity of the Hittites. But even more stunning discoveries were on the horizon, discoveries that were made quite by accident.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. Until the scrolls were discovered, the latest text we had dated back to the year 1008 AD. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date back to 100 BC, push that date back 1100 years. So these scrolls very well may have been the text that many of the Jews used at the time that Jesus was walking the earth. So these 200 manuscripts that we now have called the Dead Sea Scrolls do in fact confirm the accuracy and the stability of the Old Testament.
And archaeology continues to uncover people, places, and things that seem to confirm biblical accounts.
In another recent discovery, archaeologists uncovered a family tomb in Jerusalem. Inside was an ornate bone box or ossuary, whose remains indicated that the family was of high influence or wealth. Inside the ossuary were the bones of a man between 60 and 70 years of age. On the outside of the ossuary was the name of the deceased, Joseph Caiaphas. Here were the remains of the very high priest who had said Jesus had to die in the place of his nation, and who as the head of the Sanhedrin had instigated the plot against him.
So there are some reference points by which modern science and scholarship can evaluate the historic detail found in the Scriptures. A good case in point is the fabled Star of Bethlehem. Could modern astronomical science confirm at least that part of the story? According to Matthew, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea,
During the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." It would appear that the star was more of a marker of time than of place. The Magi were inquiring as to where the child was. Herod, on the other hand, was more interested in when they had seen the star. What happened next gives us a clear picture of what the Magi might have told King Herod about when the star appeared in the east.
There is a way. All the newborn Hebrew males up to the age of 2. Kill them all.
Your Majesty.
Yes. Kill them all.
If the gospel is intended to be straight history or biography or even journalism, then it would be a real question if they were good history, biography, or journalism. But they are not. They are gospel, good news. That is the meaning of history, the meaning of biography, the meaning of the journalism that's in there. To say that Jesus is divine or the Son of God are statements of faith, and statements of faith can never, by definition, be proved or disproved by science or history.
Some scholars today may have trouble believing it was the Christ child that was born in a Bethlehem manger 2,000 years ago. But it seems there was little doubt in King Herod's mind. And the determining factor, apparently, in setting the age of those to be slain was the timing of the appearance of the star. But what does modern astronomy have to say? What is it that might have appeared in the heavens at that precise moment of time to attract the attention of the kings of neighboring nations and send them on a 2-year journey to the obscure hamlet of Bethlehem in Judea?
Many people have considered that it could be a supernovae, or perhaps a comet, or a fireball in the heavens. In actual fact, Matthew said it was a star, and in first century nomenclature, it could be either a planet or it could be a fixed star in the heavens. The problem is not an astronomical one, it's a historical one. Until recently, scholars have felt that Herod, who was alive when Jesus was born, died in the year of 4 BC. But historical evidence now has shown clearly that he died after an eclipse of the moon in 1 BC. That allows then Jesus to have been born in the period 3 to 2 BC. Now that we know that Jesus was born in 3 to 2 BC, by the aid of computers and astronomical data, we are able to see what was happening in the heavens at the time. And it was awesome. The people would have been impressed and astounded at what they saw. We find that Jupiter was in conjunction with 8 other planets and stellar constellations at the time, which helps to show that Jupiter was the star that Matthew was talking about.
It is possible, then, that there could have been a heavenly event spectacular enough to get the attention of the Magi. Unfortunately, it is Herod's atrocity that established a time frame consistent with the historical and scientific probability.
The Bible tells us that an angel warned Joseph, and because of the angel's warning, he took his family and fled to Egypt to escape Herod's persecutions. And in fact, Jesus disappears from the gospel records until age 12. Is it possible that this child who disappeared from the records is in fact the promised Messiah who will come in power and glory?
The story of the divine birth of Jesus is a parable, a counter parable, however, to the story of the divine birth of Caesar Augustus, who was also born of a god Apollo and a human mother, like Yahweh and Mary for Jesus. It is a counter story saying that for Christians, Jesus is the Son of God, Caesar is not the Son of God.
All that we have to do is to compare the evidence of the New Testament and its reliability with any other historical document. And we can test it in terms of its textual transmission externally, internally. And when we do that, the documents of the New Testament are shown to be eminently reliable.
The Jews of the time had grown up with prophetic assurances that a Messiah would come. But what were they expecting?
Isaiah said, "He shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked." What images did those words invoke in a people suffering under Roman rule?
At the very least, that suggests a savior, a great warrior, a God who could take the Roman world by the throat and beat it into submission. The Jews during the time of Jesus held to the almost universal belief that when the Messiah came, he would be the son of David, he would rule upon the throne of David, and it wasn't difficult for these oppressed people to believe that the greatness of Israel would be restored, just as it was many centuries earlier when the youngest son of Jesse ruled upon the throne. You know, the idea of any other kind of salvation simply did not occur to them.
It's not too surprising, then, that most Jews of that time had difficulty accepting the idea that such a mighty Savior could come from such humble beginnings. But what about today? Do we have a better understanding of the role of Jesus as the Messiah?
No one has ever been born of a virgin. It violates all scientific principles and common sense. If there was a Jesus, he would have been born like the rest of us.
When I was an atheist, I would have looked you in the eye and I would have told you that Jesus Christ, if he ever walked the planet, was probably a very nice man and a very good teacher, but he never thought he was God, and he certainly wasn't God. But I spent 2 years of my life systematically investigating the historical evidence for Christianity, and I am absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ not only claimed to be God, but he proved it by being resurrected from the dead.
Surprisingly, there's little word of the whereabouts of Jesus as a boy or of his growth to manhood until his sudden appearance in Galilee at age 30. So far as the Gospels are concerned, not much is known about those intervening years. Our introduction to Jesus the man comes through John the Baptist. In fact, there are those who date the ministry of Jesus from his baptism by John in the River Jordan. Other scholars suggest Jesus didn't really begin his ministry until John was arrested.
As a young man, Jesus must have been on a religious quest. And as part of that quest, he goes out to the wilderness to be with John the Baptizer, who functions as his spiritual mentor. One might speak of John the Baptizer as the guru, if you will, of Jesus. And this suggests that Jesus underwent a process of religious development. It's not that from birth onward that he knew that he was the Son of God or the Messiah, but rather was a religious quester, just like the Buddha.
You cannot read the historical accounts of John the Baptist unbiased and conclude that Jesus was a follower of John the Baptist. See, everybody thought maybe he was because he was so unusual. And they said, "Are you the one we're looking?" He said, "No, I am not the one. A greater one than I am coming. I am the forerunner."
I am the voice of one calling in the wilderness. Prepare the way for the Lord.
John the Baptist constantly pointed to the Messiah who would come. And in his words, a direct reference to Jesus Christ.
And the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways shall be made smooth, and all mankind shall see the salvation of God. Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. Even now,
you have to remember that these writings about Jesus are called Gospels, good news. They are written to convince you to believe certain things about Jesus. So the historian has to look carefully to sort out what is history and what is theology. And much of the theological language is not, in fact, based on any historical incidents from Jesus' own time.
You come to me? I'm the one who needs to be baptized by you.
Please, do this for me. It is important that I fulfill all righteousness.
The Jesus we meet at the River Jordan soon begins to demonstrate that he is a Jesus of miracles. But can we be sure that this Jesus was the miracle worker of the Gospels? Did he walk on water, feed thousands with just a few loaves and fishes, cause the blind to see, the lame to walk? Did he bring Lazarus forth from the tomb where he had lain for 4 days, raise a small child from the dead, and finally rise from the dead himself? In short, are the miracles as real as the man? According to Luke, John the Baptist not only recognized Jesus, who was his cousin, but also recognized what his role would be while in the world. His was to be a ministry of miracles, and it would not be long before Jesus began to demonstrate his unique and remarkable power.
I have been told you have a momentary lapse in your supply of wine. You do have more, of course.
I'd no idea how much we'd need. We've served a great deal already.
But there is wine.
What is this? This is the best wine I have ever tasted. Most families serve the best wine first. Excellent.
The changing of water to wine at the wedding in Cana seems almost trivial in context, but it marks the beginning of a series of remarkable events, each one carefully noted by one or more of the gospel writers. It is this series of events that sets the stage for everything Jesus would ultimately claim to be.
I see the Gospels as a combination of history and theology. I sometimes use the phrases history remembered and history metaphorized. By history remembered, I mean some things are in the Gospels because Jesus really said them and did them. By history metaphorized, I mean the early community often used metaphorical stories to talk about the significance of Jesus. So they are a mixture of the two.
Scholars have approached Christ trying to find the right solvent to be able to distinguish between the historical Jesus and what is called the Christ of faith. No one has been able to find that solvent because the portrait of Jesus Christ in the New Testament is stubborn. It is immune to separation from the historical and the so-called miraculous Christ. The simple reason is because they are one and the same.
Jesus gathered together 12 disciples, men of little note, fishermen, a tax collector, men of the country, all except one, Judas Iscariot, a man of the city. The Gospels will be a product of this group of men. That is important to remember, since we must rely solely on the integrity of these disciples if we are to accept as truth the fantastic stories of the miracles of Jesus.
May I come to you on the water?
Yes, come. Why did you doubt?
The Gospels themselves do present Jesus doing mighty deeds, is the Greek word for it. He was an exorcist. We do believe there is a historical kernel there. And he was a faith healer. People did find healing in his presence. But after his death, other stories got added, such as walking on water. That clearly is a symbolic, some would call mythical story, not a historical event.
The New Testament is both a theological and historical record, but the important thing here is that at points where we can check out the text, the New Testament can be confirmed, and therefore we conclude it's accurate.
It is, of course, difficult to scientifically or historically prove that any of the miracles of Jesus actually happened, other than to argue that if blatantly false stories about Jesus were told, they certainly would have been challenged by his followers and eyewitness observers. No such challenges to the veracity of the Gospels appear anywhere in the record.
A leper. He's a leper.
He's unclean. Move back.
The miracles performed by Jesus were apparently not limited only to Jews. Anyone who exhibited faith could expect to benefit from his remarkable healing power.
Lord, I know that you have the power to heal. My servant lies at home paralyzed, in terrible pain.
Take me to him.
No, my lord, I don't deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, my lord, with soldiers under me. If I tell this one go, he goes. If I tell that one come, he comes. If I say to my servant, do this, he does it.
I tell you the truth. I have not found anyone in all of Israel with faith as great as this man's. Go. It will be done just as you believed it would.
Master! Look at me! It's a miracle! It's a miracle! I knew it would be so. Oh, God be praised.
According to scholars, most of the miracles of Jesus were accomplished in and around the small coastal town of Capernaum. Understandably, word soon spread of his marvelous healing power, particularly among the poor and disenfranchised. Everyone, it seems, knew who Jesus was and what he could do.
Who touched me?
But Lord, look at all these people. How come you ask who touched me?
I felt power go out from me.
Lord, forgive me. For 12 years I've been suffering with this issue of blood. I spent all my money on doctors, but they only made me worse. Please, I thought if I could touch the hem of your garment, I'd be healed.
Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. You are freed from your suffering.
Once again, Jesus calls the witnesses of the miracle to have faith while demonstrating that there are great rewards for believing in him. But the most spectacular miracles were still to come.
Take away the stone.
But Lord, by this time there'll be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days.
Lazarus! Come forth!
Jesus performed miracles, but so did many people in the Jewish world and in the pagan world of his day. So the real question is not, did he perform miracles, but what did people understand the importance of those miracles, Jesus' miracles, to be?
Jesus made utterly fantastic claims about himself, and he backed it up with his words and his deeds, and he proved it by his death and resurrection from the dead.
What we've seen are just a few of the miracles of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels. As to the truth of the miracles, we have only the word of the Gospels to guide us, which means we must try and discover how reliable the authors of these works are. In order to test that reliability, several crucial questions must be asked. Can we know with any degree of certainty just when the Gospels were written? Is there some way to determine what historical vantage point each of the writers had? And are there non-biblical sources to help us confirm or deny the truth of the Gospels and thereby the divinity of Jesus Christ? Our efforts to uncover the truth about Jesus necessarily center on the ancient documents, manuscripts, and letters produced by his followers and by the historians of the day. The New Testament, of course, provides the bulk of the evidence available to us regarding the life of Jesus. But there is a long-standing scholarly bias that suggests documents from religious sources are suspect, simply because they are religious documents. Surprisingly, historians seem to have fewer First, how soon after the events in question were the records made? Second, how reliable are those who kept the record? And third, are there independent sources that support or contradict the history?
For much of the 20th century, biblical scholars confidently maintained that the Gospels and Acts in their entirety did not exist before the 3rd or 4th decade of the 2nd century of this era, in other words, more than 100 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. This view was not based on historical evidence, documentary evidence. It was based primarily on philosophical preconceptions, even though plenty of evidence existed in the last century that the Gospels were written shortly after the death of Jesus. Now the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that the Gospels and Acts were completed in the mid to late 1st century of this era.
Assuming for the moment that is true, what difference does 50 or even 100 years make in the overall scheme of things?
It could make a difference in the sense that there would be sufficient time for myth, for legend to develop. And that's why so many people want to believe it's a 2nd century document. But now with historical discoveries of the John Ryland papyri, this is manuscripts, a portion of it written on papyrus. The Chester Beatty papyri and others now take it all the way back to the 1st century.
According to scholars, there are nearly 25,000 ancient manuscripts or portions of the New Testament still in existence today, 39 times more corroboration than for any other historical event. In fact, according to Sir Frederick Kenyon, one of the great authorities in New Testament criticism, the number of manuscripts of the New Testament and of quotations from it in the oldest writings of the Church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or another of these ancient authorities. What we have with the New Testament record, apparently, is an enormous amount of documentation produced within 30 to 40 years of the actual events. That would seem to be sufficient, but the fact is, there are scholars who still insist that the record is flawed, that Jesus did not do what the Gospels say he did.
I don't think Jesus spoke of himself as the Son of God or as the Word of God or as the light of the world. And mainline seminaries have been saying this for most of a century. And the reason is because of the way we see the Gospels. The Gospels are a developing tradition containing both early and later layers, and all of that language which speaks of Jesus as divine, as the light of the world, belongs to later layers of the tradition and reflects the perception of the community or the beliefs of the community.
Is that indeed the view of mainline denominations? If so, how do we reconcile what the authors of the Gospels themselves tell us? Were they witnesses, or did they get their information secondhand? Who were they writing for? And what were their credentials for undertaking the work?
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word. Therefore, since I myself have investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed also good to me to write an orderly account for you.
We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of His majesty.
We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ.
Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, which you yourselves know.
The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe.
According to the testimony of the men who wrote the record, they were either eyewitnesses or transcribing the words of those who were participants in the events of the life of Jesus. But more importantly, they recognized that those to whom they were writing were also participants and witnesses. Still, what do we know of these men? Are their testimonies reliable?
According to long-standing Christian tradition, Luke was a well-educated Greek physician and companion of Paul, who tells us he undertook an intensive study of all the events surrounding the life of Jesus before writing about them. Mark, the companion of Peter, also indicates a great reverence for detail in his record, devoting his efforts totally to recording Peter's eyewitness account of the life of Jesus. Matthew appears on every list of the disciples of Jesus. While most Christian scholars place Mark's gospel as the main source for the synoptics, the Catholic Church gives primacy to Matthew's first-person account. And John's gospel, while different in content and construction, is likewise the product of one who was there with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry, and in fact, lived longer than any of them.
According to Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon in 180 AD, so firm is the ground upon which these Gospels rest that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them. Which brings us to our next area of investigation, non-biblical sources, not all of which were kind nor even respectful. They do, however, attest to the fact that Jesus was a very real historical figure.
Understanding great historical figures to be divine is, in a very important sense, in the eyes of the beholder. Those are responses made to individuals about their significance ultimately. The categories used are not unique to Jesus. Christians must recognize that calling Jesus Son of God is something not applied to Jesus alone, but to other great historical figures as well.
Jesus Christ is the most fascinating, interesting person in human history. There's no one that's been like him, there never will be. Jesus Christ is the only person in human history who has ever claimed that he would raise himself from the dead and actually done it, and there's historical evidence to prove it.
Jesus Christ has transformed the world like nobody before him or after him. For example, he dignified the value of human labor in the ancient world. This ultimately led to the abolishment of slavery in the ancient world. Take another example, charity. Christ unleashed the forces of charity. Because of him and in his name, orphanages and hospitals have been founded all over the world. Take another example, education and literacy. Do you realize that hundreds of languages were first set to writing by Christian missionaries to get the Bible or the Word of Christ into that as of yet unwritten tongue? There's nobody in the world that's had the influence on planet Earth as Jesus Christ has had.
There are 8 to 10 major non-biblical secular references to the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure.
You have leaders in the second generation like Papias, which I believe was Bishop of Smyrna, and then you have Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch. And in their teachings, they say what they are teaching came directly from the mouths of the apostles. In other words, especially John, the Apostle John, discipled Papias and Ignatius. And so they're saying this is what we learned from those who lived and walked with Jesus. So even into the 2nd century, you have a direct tie back to the apostles and the 1st century church. And Ignatius points out in his writings that the 4 Gospels were so accepted already, 180 AD, were so accepted, he referred to them as the 4 points of the compass, that they were so accurate.
If historicity is to be the final arbiter and the Gospels are not to be trusted, as the critics suggest, then what are we to make of those who are contemporaries of Jesus, his disciples, and even temple priests, who obviously did not have access to the Gospels, but trusted what Jesus said to the point of martyrdom? Not all of the non-biblical sources were believers, however. Flavius Josephus, the highly regarded Jewish historian, provides corroboration not only for the life of Jesus, but John the Baptist as well. Other well-known historians also left behind brief sketches of Jesus.
Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman historian who confirms that Jesus was crucified as a criminal under Pontius Pilate. He also tells us that Christianity had its origins in ancient Judea. Christians grew to a vast multitude in Rome itself, in spite of the fact that their founder was executed as a criminal. Suetonius was an official historian of Rome during the reign of Emperor Trajan. Among other things, his writings confirm Luke's statement in Acts 18:2 regarding the expulsion of Jews from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. He also makes it clear that there were a significant number of Christians living in Rome before the mid-60s AD. The writings of Roman Governor Pliny the Younger are particularly interesting in view of the teachings presented in the New Testament. According to Pliny, the Christians were a people who loved the truth at any cost. He wrote that they met on a certain day, before it was light, singing a hymn to Christ as to a god, and were bound by an oath not to sin. Pliny the Younger was not sure what to think about all this. In fact, a remarkable note on Pliny's part is that early believers, true believers, could not be made to worship either the emperor or false gods.
Modern science also takes a hand in confirming the Gospels from secular sources that are often unsympathetic to Christianity. For example, one of the most miraculous aspects of the crucifixion was the darkness that covered the land from the 6th to the 9th hour. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three, record the event. But so did several secular historians, among them a man named Thallus, who lived and wrote in 52 AD, or approximately the same time that the Gospels were being written. Thallus tells us that the darkness totally covered the land at the time of the Passover in AD 32. And unable to find a reason for such a thing, he attributes it to a total solar eclipse. But 200 years later, Julius Africanus pointed out that the theory of Thallus was undoubtedly wrong, since a solar eclipse cannot occur during a full moon, which is always the case during Passover. Modern astronomers concur with Africanus. The Jewish Passover of 32 AD was undoubtedly during the full moon, since the entire Jewish liturgical calendar depended on determining the precise lunar position. Critics might argue that Matthew, Mark, and Luke fabricated the whole darkness episode to suit their own purposes. But if so, why would Thallus, a Syrian and a secular historian who was alive at the time, confirm it? And it should be pointed out that these historical witnesses come from original sources.
My research reveals there is no scientific, historical, physical, or biblical evidence for proving Jesus ever existed. It is purely a myth made up by those who wanted to believe in a God.
The best evidence that Jesus was a real historical character does not come so much from his followers and disciples, but from those who rejected him. His own Jewish people, the rabbis from the 2nd to 5th centuries, wrote about Jesus, wrote about his death, wrote about his miracles, wrote about his disciples, wrote about their death, wrote about their miracles. That's evidence that's reliable.
According to the historical record, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all first-hand participants in the events they were writing about, and even secular historians and anti-Christian writers appear to agree with them. The apostles, it would seem, can be relied upon. But now the question is, can our modern sciences add even more to our knowledge and understanding of the life of Jesus Christ? Most of the sciences we take for granted today are really quite new in comparison to the subject matter at hand. The art of astrology has been around for centuries, but the science of astronomy began with Copernicus and Galileo. What can we learn from the archaeologists, anthropologists, geologists? Has there been anything of value for the Christian historian found in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Can science tell us anything about the ultimate miracle, the resurrection? Science and religion have long been thought to be mutually exclusive pursuits. It was believed religious intent could not withstand objective scientific investigation. Modern archaeology, astronomy, linguistics, and statistical scientists are coming to the conclusion that the opposite is more likely to be true. Science does confirm the claims of the Bible. Oddly enough, it is the liberal theologian who seems reluctant to accept the notion that both science and religion are on parallel paths to the same destination, truth. In fact, Sir William Ramsay, one of the world's most celebrated historians early in this century, regarded Luke as a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he wrote, but this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. But perhaps the most significant archaeological discovery of the post-biblical era occurred the year before Israel became a nation. In 1947, here in the caves of Qumran, on the shores of the Dead Sea, a Bedouin shepherd, ironically perhaps seeking after lost sheep, found a cave which ultimately yielded over 1,000 priceless manuscripts dating back to the 1st century.
When the ancient Hebrew scrolls were examined by biblical scholars, they found the site contained a library filled with precious documents. In what came to be known as Cave 4, all of the books of the Old Testament, except Esther, were found. The scholars discovered that the manuscript copies of the oldest Hebrew Old Testament text, known as the Masoretic text, was virtually identical to the ancient Dead Sea Scrolls, with the exception of minor spelling details. Yet for all the excitement generated by the discovery, it was nearly 50 years before the scrolls were made available to the academic world. But for Christian scholars, it was worth the wait. The Qumran community was destroyed by the Romans in 68 AD, but the scrolls it preserved contained many similarities to the Gospels, revealing that what was said about Jesus was historically accurate. One scroll fragment from Cave 4 speaks of a Messianic figure who, like Jesus, was called the Son of God and the Son of the Most High. Another text says that the Messiah will be able to heal the sick and raise the dead. The Temple Scroll, one of the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides us with the only evidence for the reason for the Jewish Sanhedrin handing Jesus over to the Romans for crucifixion. Prior to its discovery, many scholars believed that Jews would not have condemned one of their own people to such a pagan punishment. But the Temple Scroll revealed that Jewish law saw crucifixion as the proper penalty for treason, since Deuteronomy 21 had stated that a curse was on one who hung on a tree. Since Jesus' messianic claim was tantamount to treason under Roman rule, the Sanhedrin turned Jesus over to Pilate for this sentence.
When we consider the total amount of evidence that confirms the biblical record about Jesus of Nazareth, we can have confidence that we know more about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ than we know about any other figure of the ancient world.
So far, we've been able to establish that there was, in fact, an historical Jesus. He was a real person, born 2,000 years ago at the beginning of the 1st century, who, by the sole strength of his character, created a following sufficient to worry the political heads of state in the land of his birth. Biblical and non-biblical sources alike attest to his ministry, his subsequent trial, and crucifixion. But what of the resurrection?
Do not be afraid. I know you have come looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He's not here. He has risen, just as he said he would. Come and see inside his tomb.
To this point, we have examined the reliability of the authors of the 4 Gospels, the writings themselves, and supporting documents by non-Christian writers and historians. We have explored the archaeology of Old Jerusalem and the surrounding area, and looked closely at the history of 1st century Judea. The evidence that there was indeed an historic Jesus seems clear. But was he the literal Son of God? Did he in fact die on the cross and come back as a resurrected being 3 days later? More to the point, is there any way of proving it?
The death of Jesus by crucifixion is as sure as anything can be by historical evidence. That is a fact of history. It doesn't require a faith to make it. To say that God raised Jesus from the dead after that crucifixion, that is a statement of faith. So Christianity rests on history and faith.
We have a creed of the earliest church that records that Jesus died, he was buried, he was resurrected from the dead, and then it lists specific names of eyewitnesses who encountered the resurrected Christ. Now, this creed has been dated by scholars to as early as 24 to 36 months after the life of Jesus Christ. Nowhere near enough time for legend to have wiped out a solid core of historical truth.
It is that solid core of historical truth that we are seeking, and perhaps, just perhaps, this ancient piece of cloth with the ghostly image of a man somehow infused into the fabric contains the answer. It is unquestionably the most sensitive, controversial, and scientifically probed mystery in the world today.
Called simply the Shroud of Turin, it may hold the key to the scientific proof of the resurrection itself. The modern investigation and controversy over the shroud began in 1898. A gifted Italian amateur photographer, Pio Segundo, was given unprecedented permission by the King of Italy to take the first photographs of the shroud. When it was spread out for display, Pio was disappointed because the image on the cloth was very faint. But what he caught on his 2 glass photographic plates stunned the world. It showed that the image on the cloth itself was photographically negative. Consequently, the face, almost a ghost-like image on the shroud, appeared in reverse on his camera plate, making it a positive image. It was the first time in history the likeness could be seen in full majestic detail.
It measures 14 feet 3 inches long by 3 feet 7 inches wide, which includes a hand-sewn seam added at an unknown date. These full-length dark lines are scorches from the fire that nearly destroyed it in 1532. The diamond-shaped patches cover holes resulting from that fire.
Is this the burial cloth that covered the crucified body of Jesus? Is this shroud a silent witness to the greatest event in human history, or is it a fraud? Is the connection between the supernatural and mankind scientifically provable? What could, from a dead body, create such an image? Is it possible that right now space-age science is unlocking the secrets of the Shroud of Turin? Is this the face of Jesus Christ?
There's no question about it. It is an absolute fact that the shroud is a painting, period.
Anyone who has examined the shroud up close and personal, the full shroud, not just a single fibril from it, knows that those pigments have nothing to do with the image.
Could this in fact be the burial cloth provided by Joseph of Arimathea when Christ's body was laid in the tomb? Critics of the role Jesus Christ has played in the history and development of the human experience have for generations appealed to the objectivity of science to support their claims that God, by any name, simply cannot exist.
The traditional creedal formulas that Christians recite use the mythical language of the past, in which God is right above us in the heavens and Jesus ascended to God's right hand. Those at the end of the 20th century who look through a telescope at neighboring galaxies no longer find that to be a meaningful statement about Jesus.
The scientific discoveries really confirm the Word of God, and nothing have they found to show the Bible is inconsistent, nor does it not conform with the whole world of natural laws and metaphysical laws.
There's no question that without the resurrection, Christianity falls. It is the supreme fact of history, as legal British professor Norman Anderson has said, or it is a gigantic hoax. Can we, by an appeal to that same science the critics worship, prove the reality of the resurrection? Perhaps what the telescope cannot find, the microscope can, as we examine the remarkable Shroud of Turin.
On both sides of the shroud, we see markings of a vicious flogging from the neck to the calves of the legs. There appear to be markings of wounds that would indicate the man had something with many sharp points pressed onto his head. On the back view, we see shoulders that are badly bruised, as though from carrying something heavy. Nail wounds through the wrists and feet, a distension of the thorax, all of which would seem to indicate death by crucifixion, exactly as the Gospels describe the suffering and death of the man Jesus.
For at least 6 centuries, millions of people have continued to believe that this is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Several scientific studies have also given support to this belief, as over the years the shroud has become the most scientifically studied artifact in the world.
Some of the best scientists in the world have observed this image, measured, studied it, and still have no explanation for how the image was formed.
What could, from a dead body, in rigor mortis, in a cloth, create such an image?
I feel that the radiation that made the image was a direct result of the resurrection.
Here is a truly remarkable concept, developed solely upon the research that has taken place on the shroud. No one knows, of course, how the process of resurrection might work, but it seems clear that something unique and extraordinary took place with this particular shroud.
It's basically some form of natural phenomenon, or some people might say supernatural phenomenon.
Whatever energy may have created the shroud image is certainly beyond our ability to duplicate at this time.
However, there is some academic opinion that insists this cloth is nothing more than an elaborate medieval fraud.
There's no question about it. It is an absolute fact that the shroud is a painting. When I started working on it, I expected it to be real. I was hoping it would be real. I can't argue, however, with the microscope.
The shroud shows no particles resting on the image fibrils. This proves the shroud could not have been produced by artist pigment.
The shroud image is made from tiny fibers that are 1/10 the size of human hair. And the picture elements are actually randomly distributed like the dots in your newspaper photograph or magazine photograph. To do this, you would need an incredibly accurate atomic laser. This technology does not exist.
Skeptics argue there is no provenance, no historic trail tracing the shroud prior to 1353, 1,300 years from the time it was supposed to be wrapped around Christ's body and its appearance at the church at Lire, France. Where was it all those years? Did it even exist during that period?
Skeptics are completely wrong in insisting that the trail of the shroud goes back only to the middle 1300s. It does, in fact, go back to the Bible itself. The 20th chapter of the Gospel of John, verse 6, states that when Peter entered the tomb of Jesus on Sunday morning, he found the shroud. Now, normally a grave cloth would be considered unclean and not saved. But if it bore the image of the body it had contained, this would explain why it was retrieved by Jesus' followers and treated with great reverence. In fact, a 4th century Syriac manuscript tells us the king of Edessa, a man called Abgar, was cured of leprosy when he received a cloth from a disciple named Jude Thaddeus that had upon it the image of Jesus' face. Probably for disguising the burial cloth, the shroud was placed in a specially made container with gold latticework, and when folded upon itself 4 times, only the image of the head would be seen. And again, for the sake of protection, the caretakers of the shroud did one other thing. They began to refer to it as the mandilion, a Greek term meaning simply towel.
The creation of the mandilion is a most important event. Up to the time of its exhibition in Edessa, 300 years after the crucifixion, there were no realistic pictorial representations of Jesus Christ. With the appearance of the mandilion, the pictorial concept of Christ changed drastically from a beardless youth like the Greek god Apollo to what has become the universally accepted version today. There is no doubt amongst experts that what is known as the mandilion of Edessa was a prototype for all the pictorializations of Christ from that day to this.
This early encaustic icon of Christ, produced about 550 AD and presently located at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai, is a highly accurate image derived from direct observation of the facial image on the Shroud of Turin. It has approximately 250 points of congruence with the shroud image. In a court of law, it takes only 45 to 60 points of congruence to establish a positive identity of the same face. Such congruence points include a small tear from the left eye, chap marks on the lips, and even the image of flowers around the head. This icon shows that the shroud image was well known at the time and believed to be an authentic image, and hence was used by the iconographers of the Byzantine period for their artistic productions from the 6th century on.
The shroud, or mandilion as it was now called, was apparently lost and forgotten until a flood devastated the city of Edessa. It was rediscovered in a niche above the city's west wall. It was returned to a place of veneration where it remained until 944, when the Byzantine emperor sent an army to bring it to Constantinople. We know from Byzantine records that a great celebration and parade accompanied its entry to Constantinople on August the 15th, 944 AD, and it was once again revered as the true and miraculous image of Christ.
In 1204, European knights of the Fourth Crusade stormed and sacked the Christian city of Constantinople.
Dr. Scamoni goes on to say that a French knight, Robert de Clary, wrote that he had seen the shroud with the figure of Christ on it. But after the city fell, the shroud mysteriously disappeared. Many experts believe that the shroud was carried off in secret by the powerful Knights Templar. Then later, when the French king viciously sacked the Knights Templar, one loyal knight, Geoffrey de Charnay, took the shroud into hiding in his own castle. And all the Knight Templar martyrs died without revealing the secret.
However, 2 recently discovered documents state that the shroud was carried to Athens in 1205 by a prominent knight of the Fourth Crusade, Othon de la Roche. Then in about 1353, a distant descendant of Othon, Jean de Vergy, married Geoffrey de Charny, the first certain owner of the shroud at Lire. A pilgrim's medallion from about 1356 shows the family crests of Vergy and Charny side by side below the twin image of the shroud, and this suggests an equality of ownership between them.
Geoffroy de Charny endowed the collegiate church at Lirey and gave into its keeping the artifact we now call the shroud. 60 years later, the de Charnys reclaimed the shroud, and for another 34 years, Marguerite de Charny's granddaughter refused to return it to the church, even under the threat of excommunication. Finally, and probably for financial reasons, Marguerite transferred ownership of the shroud in 1452 to the royal family of Italy, the Savoys. In 1532, fire in the Savoy Cathedral at Chambéry in France damaged the shroud. In 1578, the Savoys established their capital in the city of Turin and took the shroud with them, where it remains till this day. After 1580, the shroud was rarely exhibited to the public, and then only for short periods, some 11 times in 400 years.
There have been many critics and skeptics regarding the shroud over the centuries, but surprisingly, some of the most critical opinions regarding the shroud's authenticity, past and present, have come from Christian churchmen, beginning with a French bishop in the year 1389. Catholic Bishop Pierre d'Arcy was disturbed to hear that the shroud was being exhibited at the collegiate church at Lirey as a true relic.
Diligent inquiry and examination by my predecessor, Bishop Henri de Poitiers, discovered out the fraud. The reputed relic was nothing but a piece of common cloth, cunningly painted. Bishop de Poitiers had a full confession from the culprit painter himself, for which he immediately ordered a withdrawal of the false relic from public viewing.
The reputed Bishop Darcy letter has never been proved genuine. None of the copies of the Darcy letter that we have is signed or dated. There's also no proof that the Pope ever saw it or that it was even delivered to him.
The Darcy's memorandum lacks any probative value for several reasons, but among the most convincing to me is the fact that it is neither signed nor dated. There's no evidence that it is in the handwriting of the bishop that is purported to be, and it is simply estimated that it is from about 1389. The artist or forger is not named. There is no transcript of any sort of official investigation.
And besides, no trace or hint of identity has ever been found of the artist, who, if he ever made the image on the shroud, would have belonged among the ranks of Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Raphael.
The image on the Shroud of Turin is negative, meaning that the lights and darks are reversed from the way we would normally see with our eyes. Assuming that the shroud were manufactured in the 14th century, it would mean someone would had to have conceived of the concept of photography approximately 650 years before it was invented. I don't think so.
The shroud does appear to have at least some validity and a well-established provenance or history. But can science finally determine the composition of the stains on the shroud? Are they blood or are they pigment? Is there a way to determine where the cloth has been prior to its coming to Italy? What were the results of carbon-14 dating? And if the stains are blood, can modern tests tell us anything about what happened to the person in the shroud? If the shroud is a fake, it is probably the most astonishing fake of all time. If it is genuine, then it is arguably the first visible evidence of Christ's crucifixion and may literally be a photographic record of his resurrection.
In 1973, the shroud was brought out for a brief examination by a group of European scientists. Among them was the late Dr. Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist and one of the leading experts in dust and pollen analysis in the world. Dr. Frey almost single-handedly developed a technique to determine where criminals had been by testing samples of dust and pollen from their clothing.
Max Frey was a friend of mine and a very good criminalist, and did a lot of work on the shroud with the same sort of tapes that we used. He found pollen grains that came from Palestine and that area. We didn't. On our examination of the shroud, we found very few pollen grains, an average of maybe 1 per square centimeter.
At first, Dr. Frey's objective was simple. If the shroud had been forged in France in the 14th century, then only French and or Italian pollens would be found in the cloth. But his exhaustive analysis found some 58 specific pollens, only 17 of which were indigenous to Europe. The rest were from Palestine and southern Turkey, the site of Edessa and Constantinople. And this meant that the shroud had been in these places at some time in its history.
We had noted the presence of other objects on the shroud besides the body, and we found, to our astonishment, the highly accurate images of many flowers. There are actually many hundreds of these, but we're able to identify 28 species of these flowers with, we feel, a good degree of accuracy. The importance of this is that these flowers all grow either in Jerusalem or within 12 miles of Jerusalem. In addition, the pollens of 25 of these flowers, the 28 that we found, have also been identified independently on the shroud. Whatever produced the image of the body, which some feel is the resurrection, also produced a high energy field, producing images off every object that was in the shroud itself. And hence we have the highly accurate images of these flowers.
It has been alleged that the type of linen, the herringbone pattern weave, was very rare in the Palestine area, but that it was a very common textile after the 12th century in Europe. This is simply not true. Neither the linen nor the weave were common in Europe. This same pattern is identical to mummy wrappings that go back as far as 2000 BC. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy man who received permission from Pilate to bury Christ's body. It is not unlikely that when he gave his tomb for the burial of Christ, he may have also used expensive Middle Eastern linen grave clothes that were intended for his own burial.
The physical shroud itself is one matter for investigation, but even more mysterious and more puzzling is the haunting image that appears on the shroud itself. The shroud may be traceable to the time of Christ, but is it an image of Christ, or a painting by a very clever artist, as first claimed by Bishop Darcy and several modern-day scholars?
If it was the shroud of Christ, it would have to be made up of embalming materials and blood. What we found, microscopically, were pigments used by artists and a paint medium that was commonly used in the Middle Ages. The only colored material that we found on the shroud was the paint made from red ochre, vermilion, and collagen tempera. This proves the shroud is a painting, a beautiful painting, but nevertheless the work of an artist.
Walter McCrone believes that the image on the shroud is either a directly painted image or an image perhaps reinforced with artist's pigment. One of the pigments he's identified is iron oxide using optical microscope techniques, but an X-ray fluorescence scan of the entire shroud shows no more concentration of iron in the image areas than there is on the cloth itself. I don't believe the theory because there is so little pigment shown in the image areas on the shroud, and the image itself only consists of degraded cellulose fibrils, which have a yellowish color as viewed by the human eye.
No one has ever disputed the fact that he found real paint pigment on there, but it comes from the fact that when artists made copies of the shroud, they touched it to the shroud to gain sanctity for their creations.
The artist did an excellent job of creating an image that looks to be pretty much anatomically correct. You can find fault with it, the length of the fingers and the length of the arms, but still, artists, even 500 years ago, were able to paint figures that are anatomically correct.
To help determine the possibility of whether the shroud image is a painting, we asked Hungarian physicist and internationally known monumental artist Dr. Isabel Pixik, who has studied artists' depictions of Christ from the 1st century to the present day. She has also painted more than 450 monumental paintings of Christ and other biblical scenes.
The professional arts do not think that the shroud could possibly be a painting. There are certain paradoxes which the professional artist can see looking at the shroud, which cannot be explained and which a professional artist could not have been doing today, yesterday, or in the Middle Ages. 92 different scientific and scholarly disciplines also testified that the Turin shroud cannot be a painting.
The experts contend that the molecular paint traces found even in the unimaged shroud areas are simply dust particulates acquired over the years. Equally, they argue the unique effect on the fibril surfaces cannot be reproduced by any known paint, and far more resemble a radiation burn than any kind of intentional coloration.
The shroud is definitely not a fake or a fraud. Many of today's most distinguished scientists are convinced the shroud is genuine.
Since 1977, when the people at Los Alamos National Laboratories first put the shroud into the VP8 analyzer, this instrument has become associated with shroud research. The shroud photos taken in 1931 by Giuseppe Henri were analyzed on this equipment. Many people have sent me images to compare to the shroud. The VP8 analyzer can clearly distinguish a man-made picture from the real shroud image. The slope of a man-made picture is uniform and it rises to a fixed plateau.
From supermarket art to the great masterpieces, no painting possesses true three-dimensional qualities, and the VP8 analyzer clearly proves it.
The slope of the image on the shroud is varied and agrees with the shape of a real face. We found that in the shroud's image, there's encoded three-dimensional information, which an artist could not have put there.
A particularly sensitive point of discussion with scientists on both sides of the issue centers around what Dr. John Heller and Dr. Alan Adler determined were blood stains. The question is, are the blood stains actually blood? And if they are, how did they get there?
According to medical physicist Dr. John Heller and blood specialist Dr. Alan Adler, when paint is x-rayed, it shows up quite unequivocally. But these x-rays of the shroud do not show the blood spots, which means that the blood could not be paint. They determined not only that the markings on the shroud were indeed blood, but blood highly loaded with bilirubin, a bile pigment that would only show up if the dead man had been jaundiced or severely and traumatically beaten.
On the other side of the ocean, and working independently of Heller and Adler, the noted pathologist Pierre Ben Baloum came to the further conclusion that the blood spots on the shroud were human and type AB.
But even if it can be proven that the image is not a forgery and the blood is indeed real, does that prove that this linen cloth is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ? We thought a modern forensic pathologist might be able to tell us something about the manner of death suffered by the man whose image is etched on the cloth.
Dr. Robert Buckland is a former coroner and forensic pathologist for Los Angeles County. He is well acquainted with violent death. We asked him to tell us what he could about the shroud from a life-size photograph of it.
This is the body of a 5-foot, 11-inch Caucasian male weighing about 170 pounds. On the head, there are blood flows resulting from numerous puncture wounds on the front, the back, and the top of the head. There's a swelling over one cheek consistent with a beating. The right wrist is covered by the left hand, but there is a puncture wound in the left wrist consistent with a crucifixion injury. The classical, artistic, and legendary portrayal of nails through the palms is incorrect because the structures in the hand are too fragile to hold up the weight of a man of this size without tearing free. There are streams of blood running down both forearms, originating in the wrist areas and controlled by gravity, so the blood flows toward the elbows with the arms elevated and outstretched. On the back, there are more than 100 lesions which appear to be scourge or whip marks. Historians have indicated that the Romans used a whip called a flagrum. This implement had 2 or 3 thongs, and at their ends were pieces of metal or bone which looked like small dumbbells. Here you can see how those end pieces from a Roman flagrum fit precisely into the scourge lesions on the body. Here on the front of the body is a large blood stain resulting from puncture of the chest by an instrument like a lance or a spear. This weapon penetrated the thoracic cavity through the pleural spaces and into the heart. Later, after the corpse was removed from the cross and turned, blood dribbled out of the chest wound and puddled along the small of the back. There's an abrasion on one knee consistent with a fall. Finally, a spike has been driven through both feet and blood leaked from those areas and has stained the cloth. The evidence of a scourged man who was crucified and who died of postural asphyxia and cardiopulmonary failure is clear-cut.
The coroner's report fits every recorded detail in the Bible account regarding the beating of Christ by the Romans. It matches perfectly with everything we know from the Bible about the death of Jesus Christ.
Impressive evidence indeed that the shroud could be the actual burial cloth of Christ. But there was more, much more to come. In 1978, when the shroud was put on display for only the fourth time in a century, a team of 40 scientists, known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, using the latest high-tech equipment, examined the shroud for 5 intensive days. During the next 7 years, this tireless group spent 150,000 man-hours studying, testing, and interpreting the data from the shroud, making it the most intensely studied artifact in history. But the shroud advocates received a serious setback when one test, a carbon-14 dating analysis, produced disappointing results. An international news agency report stated that tests performed by scientists in 3 countries indicated that the shroud dated from the Middle Ages, somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390.
The radiocarbon dates that we obtained clearly put the shroud in the Middle Ages.
Carbon-14 is never used as a sole litmus test, and yet the mood of the day seemed to accept the dating without question, and the press leaped to unwarranted conclusions.
There are literally thousands of pieces of scientific data which support the conclusion that the shroud is not a fake or forgery. However, only one piece of evidence, the carbon-14 dating, indicates the shroud is of medieval origin.
The carbon-14 dating tests on the shroud are now nearly 12 years old, and the scientific argument still rages. But recently, new discoveries by Dr. Leoncio Garza Valdez, an adjunct professor of microbiology at the Health Sciences Center in Houston, Texas, cast a whole new light on the entire process of carbon-14 dating of ancient fibers and fabrics. According to Dr. Garza Valdez's findings, tiny microscopic organisms attach themselves to these fibers and over time build up what he calls a bioplastic coating. In tests on an Egyptian mummy known to date to at least 1500 BC, the mummy's wrappings carbon dated to 215 AD, a discrepancy of nearly 1700 years. Since he found the same bioplastic coating on fibrils from the Shroud of Turin, Dr. Garza Valdez's work calls into serious question the 1988 carbon-14 test results.
The 3 radiocarbon laboratories, the one from Oxford, the one from Zurich, and the one from Tucson, Arizona, have been saying that you need more than 60% of a contaminant in order to bring the 1350 date that they obtained to the 1st century. Well, we have enough of this bioplastic coating. There is no doubt about it.
Certainly the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is the very cornerstone upon which Christianity is built. Could it be that in spite of the imaginings of modern critics, that by uncovering the truth of the resurrection, we uncover the truth about Jesus?
Whatever the mechanism for forming the image on the shroud, it had to occur in a short period of time, act in an up and down direction, and produce an image intensity determined by the distance between the cloth and the body. One of the theories which seems to satisfy these characteristics is a coronal discharge similar to Kirlian photography or lightning.
One scientist said it's like every pore of the body suddenly fired a miniature laser beam for a split second of time. And so I'm sure that there's some power, some explanation that defies our current understanding.
And I believe that when the body of Christ was raised to that multi-dimension that scientists call in space, that there was a little extra burst of radiation that marked the shroud.
Just maybe God did leave behind a document of the resurrection.
Well, remembering that I'm Jewish, so that I certainly don't have any biases for the cloth, and as a matter of fact was very skeptical at the beginning, I still believe the shroud is authentic because there's really no way to duplicate the quality of the image that we have there today.
In the case of Jesus, there were witnesses for every event in his life, from birth to his death on the cross and all the teachings and miracles in between, the one thing that wasn't witnessed except by an empty tomb was the resurrection. Wouldn't it be just like God to leave us a photograph on linen of the one event that man couldn't see?
All of the scholarly criticism notwithstanding, the weight of the evidence, scientific, historical, and spiritual, still comes down in favor of the Gospels. We have seen that modern discoveries tend in almost all cases to support the historicity of the biblical accounts. Statistical science confirms the probability that Jesus was the prophetic Messiah spoken of in the Old Testament. After nearly 5 decades of examination by the world's leading scholars, the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to confirm the accuracy of the Bible. Historians continue to uncover ancient documents from non-biblical sources that tend to support the historical accuracy of the 4 Gospels. And even our most advanced space-age science has demonstrated the possibility of an actual pictorial record of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is, it seems, good reason to have confidence that the biblical record is indeed the truth about Jesus of Nazareth.
The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe.
With all the evidence before us, the question might be put to each of us, as it was to Peter.
Why did you doubt?
For 20 centuries, hundreds of millions of people have gathered in love and faith the world over to demonstrate their trust in the words and deeds of Jesus of Nazareth, who is called the Christ. For them, the truth about Jesus is not only that he did live, but that he does live. Perhaps there is more here than meets the eye. The Hubble telescope has surely not seen the abode of God in the heavens, but perhaps the microscope has given us a view of the universe that the telescope cannot. Does Jesus of Nazareth still have power to change lives today, to affect your future or the future of mankind? It just might be that to really uncover the truth about Jesus, finally and personally, we must look into our own hearts.